So today's topic that I placed the title Geopolitical Fault Lines and the West Push on Russia, China. This got inspired from his article in Substack. So make sure you go to his Substack. Just put in again Math Ehret and Substack, and for sure you'll find the link. And it starts with the obsession in the West to break the Russia-China alliance. So, and it's a continuing education for us, because when we understand things, and we don't jump into conclusions before we could even fully understand what's going on. So, Matthew, thank you very much. And why don't we start with your big event that's coming, so so that people could know about that, and plus all the other books and writings and all the videos and documents that you say, and that people know already where they can get hold of you. Okay, so thank you, Matthew.
Well, thanks, Grace, and hi, guys. Yeah, I always enjoy chatting with you both so much, and thank you for that as always very generous introduction. Yeah, I guess as a starting point, I appreciate that too. Since it's true, I have my wife and I, Cynthia, and I have a couple of events coming up this weekend. For those, if you're watching this before September 6th or 7th, and if you're in or around Ontario, specifically Toronto, we're doing two events. One, a film screening amidst the International Toronto Film Festival, of our Hidden Hand Behind UFOs episode 4 on the myth that Roswell and the creation of a new legend. That's the 4th installment, but it's going to be a self-contained documentary that we're going to air, broadcast. We're selling tickets right now. We have a theater, a cinema booked for that, and we'll have like an interactive dialogue with the audience as well about the making of it. What's the research behind this? Why are we doing this? How could there be such a conspiracy, and why would it be multi-generational? And the spoiler here is they want to create a new one world religion founded upon a reset of all religions around a new set of narratives pertaining to a drug cult revival that used to be hegemonic in the ancient world that they want to normalize on the mass base, and alien gods. So just that's my spoiler, but there's a lot more to it. The other thing, in the next day on September 7th, Sunday, we're going to be doing an afternoon symposium. We're going to bring our friend David Gosselin, who is a classical poet and somebody who's quite adept at cultural warfare, to come with us, and we're going to do 3 presentations all afternoon with a dialogue just outside of Toronto on the question of Dark Ages and Renaissances. So, what are the cultural dynamics that shape a society that is fit to survive, or a society that loses that fitness to survive and embraces a dark age set of standards, and that we see materially expressed as far as historical data when societies collapse. We have evidence in various cultures, including Europe, but also in India and China. If you look at the demographic collapse, when populations melt down, when standards of living decrease, average life expectancy decreases, overall quantity of people that can be supported in a society at a given time will occasionally collapse, like during the time of the Mongol invasions of the world. Those are great periods of case studies to look at it, to think about what should we not do, and what type of ideas of human nature, of God, of creation, of government, what are those ideas that become hegemonic versus societies that are beautiful, that create these bursts of progress, both in the arts, in science, in crafts. So what are those societies doing, right? What types of sets of ideas are activated that have to be usually fought for, not usually, always fought for, in those types of better Renaissance civilization, or those Renaissance periods. So we're going to do that on Sunday. Tickets are available for both events on Eventbrite or on my Substack. People can get those. But it should be fun. It's yeah.
I can't wait when I would be able to attend such live event in the future, but I know that would happen in the future, so it's not impossible. So, and yes, and Matthew tried really hard even to be in person in other countries, so we always take the opportunity for that as well. And just a testimony for those classes on Sundays. It's so worth your time. I usually enjoy it while I'm even sitting on a cafe in New York waiting for someone. It's like my time is so worth it. And so anyway, yeah, beautiful, beautiful. And if I'm in a place that there's no Wi-Fi, I'm like, oh no, I can't attend the class. And that happened last time, but it's okay. But sooner or later, it will be uploaded. Okay, and live event, of course, is much more. You feel that intensity, that all that you common feelings and energetic frequency, so you can sustain fight, as we always say, sustain the resistance. So anyway, Nas, it's always all articles here are always good. So I try to find which one pushes me and most of the time, and other people. And I know that there's always that if either upfront aggression or subtle messages about how China is so bad and how to divide Russia and China. So but can you start perhaps with just what happened with the latest latest meeting of Putin and Trump? Was that for you, in your assessment, like a genuine beginning of a further collaboration, but for that it seems like they've been sort of having that conversation on the back burner, or is that like also some form of like, maybe if we could befriend Russia much, maybe they'll they'll start going away from China and Russia. And also it maybe eventually, since the summit or whatever you call that, SCO that happened recently, because it seems like everything is strategically happening, right? And
Yeah.
also
I have to apologize that my internet is acting up right now. So I'm going to speak slowly, but stop me if I'm cutting out too much. I heard most of what you said pertaining to the Alaska Summit and the recent Shanghai Cooperation Organization event in Tianjin. Now, how do I think about that? Well, you know me, I'm quite cautious. I'm withholding. I try to hold a variety of hypotheses in my mind about what's going on right now, because I'm not settled entirely on motive. What does appear to me is that a decision has been made to begin within especially the Western construct, to try to change course as much as possible from the previous plan, which was, you could say, really invoked in a loud way with the collapse of the Soviet Union and the application of what George H.W. Bush had announced in 1992 as the New World Order, Kissinger and others, the end of history. And that idea was based on I think an overly exuberant celebration on the part of the City of London, Wall Street, or I would say even the Western oligarchy more generally. The heirs of the old Western Roman Empire, the old patrician class that have maintained continuity of power for centuries and millennia. I say over exuberant because I don't think it was believed possible from power corridors in the 90s that it would ever be likely, or it would have that any type of emergence of a strengthened Russia, China, Iran, India alliance capable of combining their might to oppose the will of this faction, which has wished, to restore global feudalism, world empire under an enslaved, depopulated society. They didn't think that was possible. And we heard Joe Biden make fun of this idea in 1998 when he returned from Russia, and he was still a senator, mocking this notion that Russia and China could combine their efforts with Iran. to challenge the hegemon. Now, that's exactly what did happen. And he was interfacing with networks in Russia at that time, centered around the figure of Primakov, who was a prime minister of Russia, one of the only patriots that was able to sort of navigate that storm in Russia. That was everyone knows the destruction that was put upon Russia during the terrible 90s. But Primakov had an idea that he had worked out with his counterparts in China, as well as some in India, for what became the Shanghai Cooperation Organization. It was sort of enshrined as an entity in 2000 or 2001. But the planning had already been put into motion as early as 1996. It was still very weak, though. These countries were devastated economically. They were not at all sovereign. They didn't wield individually or even at that time together the power to really challenge much of anything. So it has involved a lot of patience, a lot of planning, slow planning to build up the infrastructure, the musculature of these nations to begin to take it to the next phase that we've seen with the activation of the BRICS. That was, again, a very slow process. It accelerated a bit when South Africa joined, but it was still a very slow process. And then it culminated, or it advanced to a new phase of, I guess you could say, offensive character with the announcement by Xi Jinping in 2013 of the Belt and Road Initiative. And then this was not treated very seriously by most people among Western nations. Most think tanks did not treat the Belt and Road Initiative. It was this abstract idea. They didn't take it seriously. But as we've seen, that was a foolish thing to not take seriously, because it has grown to provide the foundational sort of structure around which many other nations, dozens and dozens, I would say even over 100 other nations around the world who have been abused by empire for generations have been able to gravitate towards, and to work as something that provides an alternative to an idea of what is investment, what is money, what is the purpose of government, what is the purpose of long-term thinking, how should investment banking work. It's a completely different paradigm than what we've been normalized around under the IMF, the World Bank structures, which are premised on the idea of predatory capitalism. Not real capitalism. It's capitalism in name only, but it's not creating capital. It's destroying capital by design. It's creating debt slaves. It's creating dependencies. It's creating societies that are stripped of their powers of standing on their own 2 feet by design. Since really the moment Franklin Roosevelt died, these things were already being co-opted to become instruments of a new reformed empire. At the very earliest days of the Cold War. So this alternative now has emerged. It's created a situation where the BRICS nations, which have grown to about 10 nations directly, there's other partner states as well, represent something like 37% of the world GDP, which is far more than the G7 nations, the so-called developed industrial nations. The Shanghai Cooperation Organization represents something like 43% of the world population and 25% of the global GDP. And it has increased. If you look at the rates of trade amongst Shanghai Cooperation Organization partner nations, it's gone from like $300 billion of trade in 2022 to $514 billion of trade this year or last year. That's an incredible rate of growth. And other nations within that are finding ways of overcoming their differences, and I think that's very important. Like India was a guest of honor at the recent Tianjin summit of the SCO in China, and that idea of being able to overcome grievances of the past that have been put there by foreign imperialists to create divide to conquer strategies is so very important. And India and China, if the Eurasian partnership is going to survive and grow successfully, it'll only happen because India and China get over their past hostilities and learn how to think about the future together and common economic opportunities together, which this is a positive sign of what we're seeing right now between them. Now, is the United States honestly liberated from this empire that's taken hold of the U.S. for so many generations, that took over control over JFK's dead body? I don't know. I don't know. I hope there is a legitimate fight around patriots centered around MAGA. I interface with many of the MAGA movement, and they're some of the best moral people that I know in America. It's great. Is the leadership of MAGA currently an independent agency operating with the best intentions? Again, I don't know. What I can say for sure is that there is a recognition that the old neoliberal hegemonic plan no longer works. It cannot succeed at competing with the pro-industrial, anti-depopulation paradigm represented by Russia, China, and their many allies. So a strategic shift of thinking is happening, and that's good. That's much more realistic. And I think that a genuine desire to avoid World War III, that recognizes World War III would be bad for business. Is my internet coming through okay, or am I choppy, by the way?
A little bit, but it's coming through okay.
Yeah, okay. All right.
Greg, it's you. You're a little bit choppy.
I know. Sometimes it happens on me too.
Okay.
Got
All
it.
right. So I'm not alone. All right. So I think that there's definitely a shift, certainly between Biden and Trump, and I think that there is a genuine intention to act upon the reality that nuclear war is not necessarily something desirable. It's bad for business, and it would be better to find good relations with Russia.
Yep.
Now, I'm not convinced. Does that mean that also good intentions exist to find better relations between the USA and China? I hope so. There's some people on the Russian side and the American side who allude to the idea that a US-Russian-China friendship would be a good idea. Kirill Dmitriev, who's a special envoy for the Kremlin, has said something to that effect just 2 days ago, saying that back channel negotiations are underway to build up an investment strategy for Arctic development between the USA, Russia, and China. Is that true, or are those just words? I hope they're true. That would be good. Otherwise, if it's not true, if these are just words, because the Chinese leadership, whenever they speak about their association with the U.S., while they applaud Russia's hopes to get a reset in good relations with the United States, China's also said on numerous occasions that they hear that they hear Trump saying that he's talking to the Chinese, but the Chinese have said he's not actually talking to us. We don't know what he's talking about. Are they lying to deflect attention away from back channel negotiations? Maybe it's a psyop. Maybe it is an intention to do what Keith Kellogg had announced some months back is the primary objective of the new USA under Trump 2.0, which is to do everything possible to weaken the China-Russia relationship. Also India indirectly, but China and Russia, because China was seen by some powerful figures in the U.S. establishment as a threat to the U.S. hegemony. So is it possible that there's still that intention to get Europe to try to figure out how to take up more of the burden of NATO and of the war against Russia, while the U.S. vectors towards putting pressure on China and simultaneously weakens those two? Maybe that's in play too. I hope not. I hope it's the previous one. And if that were the case, then there's tons of opportunities for the U.S., China, and Russia to benefit together. China is a new member of the Arctic Council, even though they are not an Arctic nation. That's big. China recognizes they merge the polar Silk Road. So there's an Arctic expression of the Belt and Road, the new Silk Road, that involves building up infrastructure in Russia's Arctic through the Northwest Passage, which cuts off 10 days of transit time between goods and freight between Rotterdam and China, versus the current shipping lanes that go all the way around the Straits of Malacca, which are very over congested, and around the Strait of Good Hope and the Cape of Good Hope, or through the Red Sea, which is in turmoil, and the Suez Canal. So that you could cut off 10 to 15 days of transit time. Also, overland infrastructure. We have already the Power of Siberia pipeline that has made some major advances coming out of the recent meeting between Putin and Xi Jinping. Also the rail line through Mongolia, the Trans-Mongolian Railway, which is another important aspect of the northern branch of the Belt and Road Initiative, but also which opens up both resources in Mongolia, creates population growth potential, but also at the same time opens up the eastern and northern part of Russia for major development, maybe even leading for rail and new cities and roads to be built up all the way to the tip of the Bering Strait, which is something I know and I've written a lot about. I'm very passionate about that idea being revived to extend a rail tunnel through Russia into Alaska and maybe down into the broader North American continent as a way to revive a lost sense of real nation building and cooperation. So these are my hopes. Does it mean they can't be sabotaged, or that more evil intentions are not pervading the nice language I'm hearing coming from some circles around Mark Rubio and Trump's associates? Maybe there are evil intentions to just simply use the word multipolarity, adapt to the multipolar sort of modality for a period in order to simply subvert it later. That's still possible. I won't throw that in the garbage yet.
I want to. Please, Grace, go ahead. Sorry.
No, I just wanted to say thank you. And I wish, because I'm Filipino, I wish that the Philippines would know what to do in terms of like which alliance, or, really being self-sovereign as a country, because we would have not even been in World War I, in World War II, if, my country is fully self-sovereign. So when you were talking about all that connection there, and Philippines is being used like as a pawn for anything that might happen in that part of the world, that's kind of my worry. And lately, I heard that Philippines, there's a ongoing conversation that about the Philippines as creating or an industry for this defense manufacturing capability. So that's kind of like a concern, because I still have families there, and I do want to go home there in a way that it's peaceful. So thank you for all that.
Right.
Sure, the
And so for
white
me,
picture.
sure, yeah, and for me that's those are the things that I look at too that cause me to, it dampens my enthusiasm. I have a lot of friends who are very patriotic, often Americans, and they're very enthusiastic for the hope that Trump is honestly pushing for behind the scenes, behind his sometimes vile language that he always projects, but there is a hope that he's actually working for this positive U.S., Russia, China friendship, which I share in my heart. But the problem is I look at these data points, as you just brought up, and this causes me to dampen my enthusiasm a little bit, because I'm not seeing action flow through. Like if we do truly want peace with China, and we do recognize that China's deep state and our deep state in the West is the same deep state that's out to kill everybody above nations, if that's truly what we recognize, then we wouldn't do the things that we're doing as far as exacerbating military tensions between U.S. proxies that have been assets for the military-industrial complex, as the Philippines has suffered for well over a century. I mean, there were massacres, genocidal massacres carried out by U.S. militarists back under Teddy Roosevelt in the 1890s, which have created these systems of dependency and manipulation, where now under Marcos Jr. you're hearing the most insane things. Like they've expanded U.S. military bases in the Philippines to use. When I look at the people who are, I'm like, okay, why are they expanding those military bases? Why is the U.S. getting more full access to these military systems? Well, it seems like you do have an agenda to prepare for an eventual war with China using their proxies like Taiwan, Japan, South Korea, Philippines, and U.S. military bases in Guam and other places in the Pacific. There's like 170,000 U.S. troops. It's growing in the Pacific. There's more belligerent military games with scenarios designed to prepare for an oncoming war with China. I've got Marcos Jr. on record saying that the Philippines will go to war with China to defend Taiwan's independence. What does Taiwan's independence mean? It's like Ukraine's independence. It doesn't mean anything. It's been a proxy for the U.S. military since the Cold War began, and the drug running KMT mafia that worked for Allen Dulles and the Nazis, or a bunch of unreconstructed Japanese fascists, for over 80 years. That's what, like, Taiwan has suffered that fate and is being used as a new Ukraine in a similar way that Japan has. Now, the Philippines is also saying that it will support Taiwan with the United States in any eventual war with China. What the hell is that? How many Filipinos have to die in that type of war? And it's so unnecessary. So if I saw, that's what I'm saying. Like, if I saw some evidence that there was some effort to retract aggressive U.S. military maneuvers from the Pacific theater, I'd be like, okay, maybe I could be more enthusiastic. But until I see that, or like Brian Berletic has pointed out quite well, and he's done a very good job proving that the National Endowment for Democracy, did that go away? I mean, Trump did cut down vastly the U.S. aid. That's good. Okay, no more, U.S. taxpayer money for LGBT theater in Cambodia. Okay, fine. Okay, but the National Endowment for Democracy is what has done the heaviest regime change lifting under the guise of democracy movements now for over 40 years. Has that been shut down? No. They just actually passed a law just a month and a half ago, which I alluded to in that article that you brought up that I published on my Substack. And Brian Berletic, broke it down very well, that this new law that was just passed basically allows for the NED for the first time to not disclose where it puts its money. So they froze it for 2 seconds, then passed a law now for the first time saying that the NED doesn't have to show the world. So you can go to their website today, and Brian Berletic had screenshots of the website a few months ago, and the same pages, which used to say where the money was being spent, even though a lot of that was still being covered up, but it was still showing you enough to see where their money in Taiwan or Hong Kong or Ukraine or anywhere, you could see where it was going around the world. Now, nothing. There's nothing there. And for people who live there, that I know who live in Thailand or who live in Philippines, they tell me that it's expanding. Brian Berletic lives in Thailand. He could see the effects of where this money is going, and he's seeing that the regime change operations, the color revolution operations, are only expanding and becoming more sophisticated, which might have even had something to do with the recent clash between Cambodia and Thailand a while ago. Sorry, my internet's so bad. So, these are things that I really encourage people to pay attention to, these things, and not compartmentalize how they evaluate the world. That's part of my challenging task, I guess.
Well, that's why we have you. Thank you very much, Matthew Hartmut, please.
Well, Matthew, this is very interesting what you said about Philippines and Taiwan, because it's, let's say it this way, never change a system when it works.
Oh, yeah.
And it's the same with Ukraine. Yeah, for example, we had Hitler here in Germany, and the interesting thing is Hitler was financed by the City of London and by the Wall Street. And interestingly, Germany is now becoming one of the most weapon industry in Europe, and maybe in one of the world. And this is, and we are, and our chancellor said 2 days ago or 3 days ago that with his words, or that Putin is one of the biggest warmonger of the centuries. So this is we are going with war with Ukraine, and Ursula von der Leyen wants to bring European soldiers, EU soldiers, to Ukraine right now without any decision. So the situation is that Europe will become the slave of the US in order to go in war with Russia. And let's say it this way, I think that's the same. These are the same think tanks which work also in Asia. So if they can use Taiwan and Philippines and other nations as a representative for the war with China, so and the United States, they need the resources, they need the commodities, and the problem is China has already a lot of commodities in China, in China by itself, and they are also controlling a lot of commodities in Africa. And in the same is also with Russia. There were 13 regions in Africa which were controlled by France, and now step by step, the France will lose control over these countries. In Burkina Faso, for example, turns by itself to Russia. So United States needs the commodities, so they need to become friends with Russia and China in order to get what they need. But on the other hand, I suppose, by their allies, they are also preparing for a potential war with these countries at the same time. And in my opinion, everything is connected to the Agenda 2030. Also, Trump is one, I suppose, who is going to fulfill this Agenda 2030. And China and Russia, because China is a communist state and Russia was a communist state, the control level of the population is much higher in these countries than in Europe or in Western countries. And this control will come to Europe and also USA, and especially in the United States, the countries will less led by the government, but more by corporations. So it will become an oligarchic, technocratic country. What do you think about that?
Due to the bad internet connection, I caught most of what you said, but there were moments where it froze and came in and out. But I think I got everything important, like the core idea that you were expressing as a concern.
Okay.
I'm not as I'm not taking as cynical of an approach necessarily on all fronts that you outlined, in the sense that right now most of the Agenda 2030 is definitely the dominant goal. That's for sure, to bring about what came out of Maurice Strong's and the Stephen Rockefeller and Gorbachev's development of the Earth Charter in 1993, and the Agenda 21 operation that was part of the Earth Charter program to supersede nation states under this idea that we need to get rid of sovereignty in order for a new global eco paradigm to impose itself from a one world government above nations. I'm totally on board. I agree that is the overarching ambition of the followers of Maurice Strong, or the heirs of Maurice Strong and company, that are very powerful. Maurice Strong, I mean, himself was an asset of the Rockefellers. The Rockefellers are a minor dynasty within the empire's hierarchy. So it's important to keep in mind, when I say from heirs of or followers of Maurice Strong, I'm speaking about it from an understanding of the nested nature of the managerial architecture of the empire. Okay, I'm not trying to say that Maurice Strong is the cause of our problems or anything. Just like I wouldn't say Kissinger is the cause of our problems, right? These people are groomed. They have certain sociopathic tendencies, a certain worldview that they embrace religiously, and they're rewarded for their competency and their devotion to that system of oligarchy. That they then rise to become the public face or the enforcer of the policy that isn't their own. They're just instruments of the will of a higher power, and that higher power smells like sulfur. So when I look at Russia, China especially right now, and I've published a number of books going through the mapping of the Chinese deep state, where it comes from, what its current configuration is. I did this exercise just to help my mind out for Canada with my book series on the untold history of Canada. Like, where are the legitimate movements and representatives of something human in the Canadian history? And then I did the same exercise over a few years for the American. It's called the Clash of the Two Americas that we've talked about, right? To try to just map out where is the legitimate human representative movement of the United States from its beginnings to the present, and where is this evil thing that has co-opted it and killed its great presidents over time and made things bad. So I've tried something similar. It's still a work in progress, but I've done a fair bit of work on the Russian and the Chinese deep states and their history, their evolution, who seeded them, who represents them at different moments. From what I gather is that beyond the word Communist Party of China, there's a much more powerful, older, but more subtle tradition embodied in Renaissance Confucianism, which has been something which the oligarchy has been trying to destroy for a very long time, which supersedes the momentary, the Red Dynasty period that was sparked with Mao Zedong and the victory over Chiang Kai-shek. Now, within the content, because you have Kairos and Chronos, right? And so in terms of the time of God of Kairos, you have this more principled idea of a more unbroken continuity of principle of good and evil manifesting, in such a way that I could say that things that were happening in Han China 2,000 years ago are just as applicable to what's happening today 2,000 years later, right? As far as the battles between good and evil, there's certain common principles that pertain to the nature of man and God, and yeah, no, we were just talking about. I was just going through my idea of why China is not really communist in that sense. They have communist mechanical aspects to it, but they also have a robust, entrepreneurial society. They're registering more intellectual patents than the United States at this point. They're all of those attributes you would qualify as being a successful capitalist society are being met by their benchmarks as far as developing both. I mean, the difference is that they don't split the nation state from the private sector. They keep the private sector under the influence of the nation state, whereas in the West, we've allowed the private banking class to take control over the nation state under the Bilderbergs and other things, which Maurice Strong was a steering committee member. So I see that there's a fight to try to co-opt or influence what the terms of the new system are going to be, and we're gonna have a new system. So when you look at the very ambiguous language of the UN Sustainable Development Goals, you'll hear the Chinese, the Russians, Angela Merkel and Mertz and US assholes around Biden all saying nice things about the UN Sustainable Development Goals, which is a list of 17 things. But they mean very different things, because they'll say end poverty, water for everybody, healthcare access for everybody. Okay, fine. No one's not going to agree to those things. But then where one side is just using the flowery language, but actually has an Orwellian set of opposite meanings, water for those who can afford the water or who have the right social credit scores to access their water, rations for the week. That's a very dishonest, silent intention. Whereas when I look at what China's been doing with their allies, they're actually building massive water projects and making it abundantly available for everybody. And they're building they're building the Great Man-Made Water Project, which is greening deserts, and it's doing all of these things. So I think they're fighting over control over what the definitions of the UN mean. What is the definitions of the sustainable? What does sustainable mean? Does sustainable mean stasis or degrowth, or does it mean sustained development? Which is when I look at how the language is being used in the context of the Chinese intelligentsia, it's usually geared towards sustained development, always going to the next platform of progress. So there's a fight over what is, do we go for depopulation under this idea of global regulations, global, what is this idea of this governing architecture for the world? Is it going to be premised around divide to conquer, depopulation for an elite, or is it going to be based upon the idea of empowering individuals and different nation states and societies to participate in solving problems for their future? And that's where I see the battle lines currently. And so I don't see everybody in on it in the way that you were alluding to in your question, if you know what I'm saying.
Yes, I understand. No, So the situation is that let's say it this way. I was informed that, or I liked the book from John Eric Phelps, in which he said that the communism was established by the Vatican from his point of view, and that the Vatican and that the Chinese government have also very close ties until now. And
there's a big fight by the Vatican. Like Pope Francis was trying to get control over the Catholic institutions of China, and China had kept Pope Francis away from that because they recognized that the Vatican has been used more often than not as an insurrectionary force to dissolve the culture of China. Now, China does have, within their 1982 constitution, it's enshrined the idea of religious freedom for people. That's part of their constitutional legal code. Except that you can't have the intention of using the cover of religion or missionary work in order to undermine the sovereignty of the society, which has been the case since the Opium Wars back in the day, which was probably at that time it was less Vatican and more Anglo, Anglo-US missionary work that was being done to prepare the groundwork for the drug wars, the drug trade, and the civil war in China, which was overseen by British and American missionaries that brainwashed some guy who just woke up and said he's the Messiah of China, the brother of Jesus, and that resulted in this 15-year civil war during the Second Opium Wars. But it was all missionaries that were doing a lot of this dirty work. Not to say that all missionaries are bad, but I wouldn't agree necessarily with Mr. Forbes's full conclusion that the Vatican is in control or in collusion with China. Although I'm sure that there's been evil satanic, operatives within the Vatican who have had relations with the Chinese deep state. That I would agree with.
Yeah, I have the impression that China and Russia, they free themselves from this control of the Vatican, and this is a reason why the Western world is now more or less as an enemy. Because in 2014, in the moment when Mr. Putin, when President Putin conquered Crimea, he also put the Orthodox Church into full power.
Yeah.
And this was, and the Orthodox Church is the real enemy of the Vatican so far, I understand.
Well, the Vatican's a tough one. It's a tough one because it's so contaminated with ancient power, right? Like ancient, old power. But at the same time, there's a lot of assassinated popes. There's a lot of assassinated cardinals. And so there's something also profoundly good, which at times has expressed itself with practical power based upon people, I think, who within the context of the Vatican or within the Catholic political systems, because it's got its own internal political systems, its own, right, over the centuries, have actually read the words of Jesus. They read the Bible and they took it seriously and acted accordingly, versus those. And the way I see it is that most of the evil done by the Vatican over since the very earliest days of the collapse of the Roman Empire, or the Western Roman Empire, much of the evil, if not all of the ignorant evil that's been done, as far as sponsoring religious wars at different times, burning heretics who often turn out to be innocent innocent victims. A lot of these things, the abusive policies in many of the Jesuit run schools of the in Quebec's history, which is where I live, there's a lot of trauma that baby boomers have suffered under Catholic Jesuit, abusive schooling, other things. A lot of this, the worst behavior can be more accounted for by the fact that we didn't actually deal with the satanic pagan mystery cults when the Council of Nicaea happened in 325. And many of those, there were some victories against the networks around Arius, who was being sponsored by Constantine. Like Arius, who was ultimately his views of how to interpret the religious texts of the New Testament were ultimately rejected. But Constantine was his sponsor when Constantine was still a pagan. He was still like you at the time. He only became a so-called Christian on his deathbed. At the time that he was sponsoring the thing, he was still a pagan. He was still a Sol Invictus worshiper of Mithra, as was Nero earlier on, as was anyway. So you had a variety of fights over what would be this thing called Christianity in an institutional way. Now, it was known that it had to institutionalize some way because the earlier, first century, second century, third century Christianity was being infiltrated by hundreds of different sects of Gnostics. So the Neoplatonics. So you had at that time, Plato's school had been already taken over by the Neoplatonic Hermetic occultists. This, I think, happened around the 90 BC. So the actual legitimate Platonists operating through the academy were by this point purged, and his enemies began to take over. The followers of Parmenides, of specifically the Parmenides school, began to increasingly take full control of the academy, and the academy became a center that would shape little cults. And in some cases, they would masquerade as nominally Christian, like the followers of Simon the Magician, who had a big following, and he was masquerading like he was the avatar, the reincarnation of Jesus, and he had his Mary Magdalene whore wife Helen, who he toured with, who was this prostitute he got from a brothel, and convinced her that she's a deity figure, a Sophia figure, and they would tour together doing magic tricks, and people believed that they had superpowers. And people like Peter did battle with Simon the Magician in Rome, which led to his undoing, thankfully. But he was sponsored by Nero. Yeah, my internet is so bad. Is my internet so bad still? I feel like I'm cracking in and out.
Sometimes, but it was very good the whole time, but only now about 10 seconds was not good. But the rest was very good. Thank you. It was very...
Okay.
Wow, yeah. That's what...
Yeah, so all that to say, the followers of Simon the Magician created spin-off sects, that created in the 2nd century, 3rd century, false gospels, like the Gospel of Philip, which is a disgusting...
You're gone.
Oh, you can't hear me?
No, you're good. No, we can hear you.
Can hear me?
Sorry.
You can hear me?
Yep.
Okay.
Yep. No,
because I can't hear you.
Oh.
Hard.
You can't hear me?
I can't hear you.
Hello?
But you can hear me.
I can hear you.
Grace, I can't hear you either. That's so weird. Why can't I hear anybody?
Can you?
But you guys can hear me, eh?
Grace, can you hear me?
Okay. All right. Well, I guess I'll keep talking, but I can't hear you. So that sucks for dialogue. One second. I'm going to change my speakers here to go into my earbuds instead, and hopefully that fixes something. Default speakers Yeti. Okay. Speak again.
1, 2, 3, 4. Yeah. Can you hear us now?
No, it's not working.
Can you hear us?
Unbelievable. What's going on? Okay, I'm gonna leave and I'm gonna come back in.
Yes.
Okay,
please.
I changed my speakers one more time. Speak again.
Yep.
Nah, fuck.
1, 2, 3, 4, 5.
It's Drago. He's brilliant. Go talk to Drago. I'm gonna leave and I'm gonna come back in. Okay.
Good. Okay, Drago. Oh no, we have.
Yeah, sorry for being late. I mean, I'm definitely gonna rewatch the first card because obviously, Matt and Matt is your name.
Volume is not
Amount of information and I mean, and not just the information, but also the perspective that he has. It's incredible. I mean, it really is.
Can you hear? There's a static. How about Drago? Volume.
Can you hear me, guys?
I can hear you. Yeah.
Okay.
But I can hear myself as well. It's completely crazy. I suppose we talk about subjects which someone doesn't want to hear.
Yeah.
Yeah, but suddenly, there's so much static.
No, the sound is really not our friend today, eh? Jeez, this is okay. Should I just keep? Should I keep my train of thought going? Okay. Oh, we lost.
We could hear you clearly, man.
You could? Okay. All right. Well, I can hear you now. So yeah, basically my point to Hartmut, because I'm like, okay, there's a clash of two Vaticans. Like I was saying, that there's a clash of two Chinas, there's a clash of two Americas, there's these two different opposing traditions also within the Vatican, which is why so many leaders within the Vatican have at different times died very strange deaths. Often when they're trying to ban the Jesuits, like the Pope of 1773, who said, when I die, it's going to be because I'm poisoned by the Jesuits, because he just banned them from Europe, right? And then he dies. Right. There's many cases, both recent and distant into the past. So what I was saying is that, there was an effort made to infuse or to get many of these Gnostic gospels infused into the official texts, or to create a creed at the very least, like Arius was saying, that denied the divinity of Christ. And different arguments were made to try to undo the danger of what became the Nicene Creed, which basically created. So you had the agreement to enshrine certain documents that would become known as letters from Paul and other apostles that would become the New Testament, while rejecting other texts that had a lesser epistemological sort of weight to them, or sometimes a completely nefarious character, like I would say the Gospel of Philip. But you also had the idea that there was certain unnegotiable principles, of which, the idea that Jesus is of the same essence as God. There's certain ideas like that he died, was resurrected. There's certain ideas that were just unnegotiable. And I think that a lot of that institutionalization creates power, because now you have an ability to get centralized action that you could not have get when something was more broken up in an anarchistic way. Like the earlier Christian church had a more anarchistic, there was less ability to get any common action or common agreement of what this thing called Christianity actually is. So there's more power to abuse, more power if you can get control of those levers of an institution. You could do a lot. You could project evil power more onto your victims. But at the same time, there's a power to do good. If you're a noble person who uses that type of centralized power of an institution, you can do a lot of good. So there's this battle over like who's going to influence policy and doctrine from the church from that standpoint. And I think too much of the time there has been infiltration so even though the mystery cults kind of went underground, especially by the end of the 4th century, many of them were banned by Theodosius and Stilicho, his general and advisor. The Sibylline books were burned. Good, frankly. The Sibylline books were trash. They were just the recountings of the Oracle of Delphi that the Roman Senate had been conferring to for centuries to determine all important acts? Do we go to war or whatever? Let's confer with the Oracle of Delphi through the Sibylline books, the Sibylline Oracle. Those got destroyed. Things like the cults of Mithra, the cults of Isis, had to go more underground. And so some emerged as different nominally Christian orders, but were never really truly Christian. They always had an esoteric inner teaching, maintaining the cosmology of the Gnostics and of the earlier, esoteric Zoroastrian, Manichaean sort of worldview. The Gnostics viewed the universe as made in the image of an evil god, and it's only by breaking out of our traditions that we could achieve sort of divinity of the god that is not capable of the good light god that is beyond creation, that is incapable of intervening or influencing creation, because creation is the influence of his mutant demiurge Yaldabaoth or whatever, which created the world evil in his image, that we have to break free of, right? By becoming as apathetic basically as possible, by breaking out of the belief in conscience, morality, conventions, family. Those were things that were holding us back from being the divine truth that we are, said the Gnostics, or the Manichaeans that said that the world is ultimately shaped by, an equal clash of evil forces that have an equally existent claim to existence as the forces of light and goodness, and that to honor goodness you have to also honor evil. So you would come to these sorts of messed up conclusions. And in many of these seemingly Christian sects, they had this inner teaching core that maintained that philosophy, while the outer teaching core, the exoteric version, did not. It had a much more sort of innocuous, harmless sort of teaching for the uninitiated. But in the Vatican, too, it seems like early on you had infiltrators who began to act Christian, use the right language, but then would actually work to subvert the church from within. And one of the key formulas that have always been used for social manipulation and the corruption of institutions by these occult agencies, as far as I could see, is the idea of the left-hand, right-hand path, or the Apollonian Dionysian formula. So on the one hand, you create an Apollonian institution or an Apollonian order that behaves from, let's say, a very stoic standpoint. So their behavior is premised on the idea of following rules, being very, very legalistic, very, very dutiful, and withholding of your passions, right? Very, very utilitarian. And on the other hand, there would always be whenever you see one of these Apollonian orders masquerading whatever as a Christian or a Muslim institution, whenever you see one of these being created, look also for where a left-hand path or a Dionysian order is being co-created at the same time. And you'll always find that at the same time. So, for example, the Jesuits, okay, they were created in 1534. Okay, they had a role to play to deal with the emergent Protestant movements of Luther. Okay, because you had things like the Peasants' War, the German Peasants' War, the religious wars were already brewing pretty badly in the 1520s. So you could see where it was going. So the Jesuits were created nominally to put down, to subvert that type of disruption, to defend so-called the institution of the church. But at the same time, you had what was emerging. It only got this name a little bit later, like 80 years later, but the Rosicrucians. And there's this woman named Dame Frances Yates, who's written many books, and she's very useful because she's an adept occultist and academic who was assigned to shape certain reconstructive narratives of our history, of what was the Renaissance, what was our history, around the idea of romanticizing the Rosicrucians. And the Rosicrucians, as she points out, actually had a common origin and mandate as the Jesuits, and they would work together, where the Jesuits would work to transform alchemically the church into the most rigid, reactive, version of itself. Crush the heathen. Like it would be very rigid in its behavior. it created a stifling, spiritually suffocating environment for people who were victimized by that type of imposition from above, that it would tend to process or generate a rebelliousness, a legitimate rebelliousness from people who were suffering, that would then be captured by the type of Rosicrucian climate of encouraging, free thought, a golden age of liberty for all, and freedom for everybody. And that was part of the promise of the Rosicrucians in their original propaganda, the Fama Rosicruciana, the chemical wedding of Christian Rosenkreuz, the Confessios. So part of it, if you read them, it's one, they work in encoded messaging. So there's like different ways to read it. If you have a cipher, you can get a deeper understanding of the hidden meaning of the text. But if you don't have a cipher, you'll get another message. But they all tend to celebrate this idea of freedom from tyranny, freedom from and we just have to unleash what becomes the 30 Years' War. Basically, that Emperor Frederick V is all on board. He's convinced that he's kind of like a new Julius Caesar type of reformer who's going to usher in a new golden age, with Elizabeth Stuart, the daughter of James, King James. But these guys are being shaped and managed by Rosicrucian handlers like Michael Meyer and like Andre and Robert Flood and the followers of John Dee, who are the black magicians of the British or the English intelligence agencies who have gone to Bohemia and have worked with Rudolph II and have worked on shaping the minds and the culture of the leaders who would eventually become Frederick V, who ushers in the 30 Years' War. But it's again against a legitimate thing to resist, which is this Jesuit thing. But the Jesuits are again a Gnostic order that were spawned out of it was a Gnostic order itself that was generated, and I wrote a whole chapter on my book. I'm not gonna go through it at this moment, but that was shaped by the same agencies that were creating the Anglican Church in 1534. So the same year that the Jesuits are being created under Ignatius Loyola and Francis Xavier in 1534 in France at the University of Paris, same year that the same agencies are also working to create the Anglican Church. You have the Order of Malta also being set up in 1530. This is while Rome is captured Rome is under the control at this point of the Habsburgs. The Habsburgs have been looting Rome since they came in 1527. They completely wiped out the legitimate Christian Promethean leadership of the Roman Church, the followers of Piccolomini, Piccolomini, the guy who was a major patron, the Pope Pius II, who was the major patron and sponsor of the best of the Renaissance. The Borgia family, Caesar Borgia's father was Pope Alexander VI, who was, it seems, also killed in 1500, but who was a big sponsor of the best of the Renaissance, of Da Vinci and of others. They were wiped out, and after the Habsburgs had finished the sacking of Rome, the Roman population fell from like 90,000, 90 was it? By 90%. Like the population was at 10% of what it was before the sacking began. So it was a complete purge. And coming out of it, the Vatican was much more captured than ever before, and a new Neoplatonic takeover began. So the Neoplatonics that had formerly been kept outside of the influence of policymaking in the church became all of a sudden a much more dominant thing, which sanctioned the creation of the Jesuits, which involved the creation of a new Neoplatonic academy, the translation of Hermetic texts and the promulgation of Hermetic alchemical texts that had formerly been popularized by certain Dominicans, like Albertus Magnus, who was, again, the Dominicans were created at the same time as the Franciscans. So you had the Dominicans playing the role of the iron sword of the church, destroying heretics, the dogs of Christ who will burn the earth with Christ. And that's literally the Dominican symbol, is a dog with a torch running around burning the earth for Christ. And then on the opposite side, you had the Franciscans, co-created at the same time after the Fourth Crusade, created again. Francis of Assisi and Dominic de Guzman, they knew each other. There's paintings and statues celebrating their friendship. but one operated on the right hand, the other the left hand path. And while the Dominicans tried to enshrine the doctrines of scholasticism as the only way to be permitted to run a university, the Dominicans said you had to enforce the formalistic doctrines of Thomas Aquinas, which became the heart of scholasticism, the idea of abiding by rules, before common sense, having debates about how many angels can dance on the pinhead of a needle, these types of things. That was like, it was completely insane. It was driving people nuts. It was suffocating. But the Franciscans were encouraged to have free thought, to go outside, but free thought within certain conditions. And that's sort of how this game has been played left and right. And so a lot of the worst, I guess that's my point. I'll wrap it up that way. The worst of the church, it seems, was done both from within, the infiltration from within, and from the satanic counter agencies operating outside of the church, creating things like the Plymouth Brethren, or earlier the Moravians, or earlier the Hussite followers of Jan Hus, that became quickly the what do they call it, the pit people, when they were found to be carrying out demonological works and black magic one too many times. They were like, they had to escape persecution by going into the forests of Bohemia and all across the forests of Europe. And they became known far and wide as the pit people, who lived in the caves and the pits, carrying out rituals at night. And there are stories all across, from Italy and Switzerland all the way up to Germany and Prussia, of like these pit people coming into villages and stealing children that would be used in sacrifice, or women, until they kind of came out of that after a few decades as what becomes the Moravian. This is what generates the Swedenborgian movement. This is what generates the Methodist movement, that are all, people who are being trained in these cult communes that are working, that exist because of the stifling environment created by the church. Not that different from what the World Economic Forum has done with taking the role in our current day and age of this like stifling, technocratic, anti-liberty movement from above, and then creating an environment of rebelliousness, which is legitimized rebelliousness. It's something that should be rebelled against. But if you look at how many Gnostic movements have been created and incubated over the centuries to capture that resistance, like the Scientologists, which are followers of L. Ron Hubbard, who is a follower of Aleister Crowley. The Scientologists are very influential amongst conservative, anti-Great Reset conspiracy movements. They're very influential, more than you'd realize. Like the anti-vax movement, I'd say it's so controlled by Scientologists. It's dizzying. And Matthew Crawford has done an immense amount of work going through the actual players. It's wild. So anyway, that's what I'm saying. It's just people have to be aware of this twofold path that the empires always use to get us to fall into these traps that we always fall into again and again.
Thank you. Very interesting. No, this is because you have these traps all over. Let's say it this way: the Vatican, the government, the democracy is a construction. Yeah, and for example, the Inquisition is given to the Secret Service industry. The Inquisition, the Secret Service industry was taught by priests of the Catholic Church, because they know, because of the Spanish Inquisition, what torture is. Yeah. So the whole construction of democracy, with the governments, with the ministries, with the Secret Service, this is it's a proxy for the power of the Vatican.
Yeah, I mean, it's again important to map out these orders, like I mentioned, the Franciscan order, the Dominican order, the Cistercian order that gave rise to the Templars, the Templar order that didn't really disappear, even though there was a crackdown. It did not disappear. It transmogrified. The order of Hospitallers, which was sort of the right hand path, the Apollonian path to the Templar left hand path, the more feminine versus masculine principles that the oligarchy used to co-create at the same time to manage the Crusades, the Templar and the Hospitallers. Now these orders, the Hospitallers became sort of retooled under the Order of Malta and Cyprus, or in Rhodes, in 1530. But it's the same order, and if you look at it, like all of the leaders of the CIA are also simultaneously members of the Order of Malta, or knights of the Sovereign Order of Malta. Leading members of the Nazis, Reinhard Gehlen, was also a knight of the Sovereign Order of Malta. But also, you had different figures within the Nazi high command who were also at the same time Jesuits, right? And New Templars, like Himmler created a whole New Templar order, modeled on the Jesuit constitution, as he called it. And he said he wants a new order founded upon the discipline and secrecy of the Jesuits that would animate this new movement of enlightened Christian, or I wouldn't say Christian. In his mind, he's thinking like Nordic pagan mercenaries masquerading as Christian, that would have their own roundtable that he built up in Wewelsburg Castle that brought in Tibetan monks, hundreds of Tibetan monks, to carry out weird meditation rituals and shit to try to channel dark forces from the beyond or whatever. Anyway, like that's shit that was really going on by the guy who created the Ahnenerbe, like the entire, movement to pursue Solomon's temple, the Holy Grail, the Hollow Earth, all of the stuff that Himmler was overseeing was based upon this revival of the Templar Jesuit operation. Now, Albert Pike also makes the point that the Templars became the Jesuits, that there's a direct continuity between the Templar organization, both in its banking functions, its spiritual and its militaristic functions, which operated like a cult of Mithra, the Mithraic warrior, male-only warrior movement that typically also had sacred homosexuality and things like that, and drugs. That was also a model for what was embedded within the more sophisticated Jesuit order, as Albert Pike, he's not somebody to be ignored, had said. And in my research, I found that that's substantiable, that's actually something that can be demonstrated to be true through the conduit of the Franciscans, the Dominicans, and the Rosicrucians. So I do see that there is a continuity of policy, of doctrine, and you always have to map out as many of these orders as possible, because this is what's making it's these things that have an incredible amount of influence within institutions of the Christian Church, of the Catholic Church.
But it's not only this. For example, please correct me if I'm wrong. But for example, the Templars, if you want to join the Templars, you have to give all your properties and assets to the Templar order.
Yeah.
And then you got only that what you needed. So you can say that the Templars were the founding fathers of communism.
I mean, I think you could say that to a certain extent, but they had a huge amount of influence. I mean, don't get me wrong. If the poor knights of Solomon's Temple were not that poor. Like, that was the nominal promise of it. And it's true, like, for many of the lower order members, yeah, but they had like a huge amount of power, influence, castles, all sorts of things. And then, most 9 out of 10 members of the Templar order were not mercenaries. They were of the administrative banking priest class that ran like all the banking of Europe during that entire time. So they were very fabulously wealthy as sin. But yeah, you could say, sure, why not? I could agree with you on that. Yeah, that ultimately the hypocrisy of the promise of like perfect equality for initiates would there's sure, you could say that's similar to the communist promise too. Why not? Okay.
Okay, thank you so much. I get Pastor Drago. Thank you. It was a real pleasure talking to you, Matthew.
Yeah,
Like
dude.
again. Thank you.
Hey, Drago, how you doing, man? What do you think of this stuff, Drago? Like, what are your thoughts on this whole, like, oh, I lost Drago. Damn, we lost Drago. Damn. I wanted to get his thoughts on the whole, like, Vatican-China relationship and history.
It's coming back.
He's coming back? Okay. Hey, there he is.
Sorry, guys.
Right.
Can you hear me now?
Yeah, I can hear you. Yeah. I was
Okay,
curious. Well,
great.
what's your take on some of this stuff, man? Like on the like, how do you respond when people ask you about the corruption of the Vatican?
I mean, I'm always impressed by. I'm always impressed, whenever I participate in any sort of, program with you, because I don't really. I mean, I'm a big fan of history. I love history. I basically wanted to study history at some point, and I consider it fascinating. But just the history that's behind the official story, the official narrative, that's something that you never get to hear anywhere, or very at very few places. So, especially when it comes to these secret societies and the way they influenced everything that's going on around us. And of course, as I said, apart from you, I really don't know anyone who can pretty much present the entire thing from A to Z, and really it's fascinating. I mean, I don't even know what to ask. I just want to listen. I would listen to it all day. It's so incredibly interesting. And of course, I mean, it ties into the geopolitics of today, because it's impossible, not to see the consequences of what actually happened at the time. Let's say 50 or 100 years ago, or 500 years ago. Most people would never even think about it. I mean, most people wouldn't even know how to ask a question regarding that, because they wouldn't know where to start. And it's so impressive that you know all these things. And I mean, how do you even get the data on all that? I mean, is it difficult to actually get verifiable data on these issues?
Yeah, it's sort of like looking for like anomalies and paradoxes. So you start with you try to get whatever the topic is, right? You're like, okay, well, what's a common explanation or a common narrative that people are expected to believe to be allowed into polite society or in academia? So what's the common interpretation for a thing, right? So let's say, for example, for Canada, the way I began my Canadian history research is that, like, history is written by the winners. So that means a priori that any accepted narrative that I look at about what explains Canada is probably full of garbage, mostly garbage, because the British Empire kept control of Canada. So then how do you begin to piece together to something, a more truthful narrative? And I started with the anomalies. So, like, why was Benjamin Franklin up in Montreal to try for 6 weeks before the Declaration of Independence? Why was he here? Why is it that it was Benjamin Franklin that created the Canadian Postal Service, the first newspapers? Benjamin Franklin is the most non-Canadian thing I could think of, but it was him. So, like, and then why did Quebec back then fail to accept his offer to join as the 14th colony? So that's an anomaly, right? And then I could start, and then my research becomes focused on trying to resolve the dissonance, because the paradox is like a dissonance of the mind. It doesn't fit with anything nothing that is commonly accepted can explain that empirically verifiable phenomenon. He was here, he had these intentions, I could read his letters, I could look what he did. What the hell, right? And so then I'm now looking for who subverted him. Okay, well, then I could look into the story of, like, the Jesuit Archbishop Briand, who passed an edict saying that if any Canadian, a French Canadian at the time, goes and fights with George Washington, they will burn in hell forever. They will be excommunicated, which scared the shit out of enough French Canadians who were very sympathetic to fighting the British Empire. They just fought the 7 Years' War, so they had no love for the British Empire. But instead of fighting, most of them were scared shitless of burning in hell, so they stayed with the crown. And so I could then piece together a story based on, like, surviving. There's other historians who look at narrow things, but it's useful. They'll look at Benjamin Franklin's time. Who was he talking to in Quebec? Who was he working with? Who was Archbishop Briand or the Bishop Briand working with? Well, people have put together books that are usually very myopic but useful, but myopic because they lack a higher narrative. Me, I've got a higher hypothesis or a higher idea in my mind of like this universal struggle between good and evil, and I look at conspiracies as real and causal. So like because of that, I try to fit my discoveries about the drama of that moment into a broader story about the tragedy of Canada. And I could see it doesn't take me long before I realized that the reasons why the Republican rebellions of 1838 were subverted had everything to do with the failure of the Quebecois to accept the Ben Franklin Challenge 50 years earlier. And then I could sort of start building a continuity, and it doesn't take one long before you're like, okay, I can't account for the Civil War if I don't look at the fact that Albert Pike, a leading Confederate general who was working with Mazzini, who was part of these color revolutionary operations that he was creating with Lord Palmerston in London after Mazzini got kicked out of Italy. Like Giuseppe Mazzini was the guy who was the tyrant of Italy under the triumvirate for a year before he got kicked out. But he was the godfather of modern color revolutions back before they were called color revolutions. They were called Young Albania, Young Europe, Young Greece, But this guy's talking with Albert Pike. Albert Pike is not just the grandmaster, overhauling the Scottish Rite, writing morals and dogma, but he's also a Confederate general. He's running the Young America movement. He's part of the Order of the Golden Circle. And I could read the writings of the Order of the Golden Circle going back to the 1850s, which were co-created with the B'nai B'rith as a Masonic agency that had like 100,000 members in the 1850s USA. What the fuck? So I'm like, well, what is this? Is this a real thing? Yeah, it's a real thing. And they've got maps that they were publishing of the Empire of the Golden Circle. Like they were openly publishing this thing. And that Empire of the Golden Circle involved not just it was basically the plan of what the Confederate States would do after they secede successfully and establish a new confederacy, right? Would they stop there? No, they were not going to stop there. They said it in their founding documents. They were going to expand the slave empire to annex Mexico, Central America, South America. And it was a giant, like you could see somebody took like a big compass on a map with the center being Cuba, this island headquarters that was going to be the capital of this new empire. And they just drew a giant friggin' circle. And they called it the Empire of the Golden Circle. And it was always going to expand. It was going to have a special relationship with England. That's why England was such a big military supporter of the Confederate South. And that's why their banks helped their Confederate South so much, the Louisiana banks and these things. So I can look at that. But then I can also read Albert Pike's writings. And then I could read his morals and, I got like, it helps where possible to buy, like, look for who made history and then see if they wrote things. And then like Albert Pike wrote this book, Morals and Dogma, back in 1872. And you could read the damn thing. And he goes through like what his arcane school is. What is the religious foundation of this elite society that he wants to rule the world. And he talks about it. Again, he's an asset for Giuseppe Mazzini, and I could read his writings and he goes through it's in this book that the association, he spends a lot of time talking about the continuity of the Templars into the Rosicrucians, into the Jesuits, and he also talks about the Order of Malta. He talks about these things. He does it in a romantic way. He likes it. He's a part of it. But then, I know he's evil, so he's a Satanist, so I could still use that and then have that guide a more critical investigation of the facts he's raising when I'm looking at these things, like who created the Order of Templars? Well, it's Bernard de Clairvaux. Okay, well, I can. Bernard de Clairvaux was a Cistercian radical, a grand strategist who put two popes onto the throne of the papacy of St. Peter's. Bernard de Clairvaux is immensely popular even today amongst trad Catholics, like the young, like he's really popular, but he's also like a big proponent of bridal mysticism. The idea of like interpreting the idea of the bride of Christ, some of the language of the New Testament from a very sensual, erotic interpretation, that you're literally having sex with Christ, right? That the church, that's what you're literally doing when he's talking to his order of nuns. And you have a special Cistercian order of nuns called the Clares, the Order of the Clares. and he's creating in his language, in his sermons, both on the one hand, he's writing the charter for the Templars to try to create a legal justification why Christians should actually be allowed to murder like other people, which, if you're a Christian, that's a problem, because Christ is telling people to love your enemies. So to try to create like a new mercenary warrior order of Christian mercenaries or Christian warriors, they have to be ready to kill a lot of people in the Crusades. But that's not easy to do. So he creates this whole legal argument why that's actually why you're being the instrument of Jesus when you kill sin, because heathens in his world are basically just embodiments of sin that should be destroyed. And he creates this whole thing. And then he creates the order of the Templars, how they're going to behave, what their modus operandi is going to be. So you can read Clairvaux, and then you could read why he destroyed how he destroyed his enemies. And people have written books about the battles between Bernard de Clairvaux and Peter Abelard. And I'm like, okay, well, if I know that Clairvaux is evil, even though his published works won't be obvious, it will tend not to be obvious, but I know what he did, and I know what he's a part of. And so I that's how I interpret his different erotic language that he embeds in his sermons, right? He's creating movements that sensual eroticize the spirit and bring us into a perverse state of Gnosticism. That's one of the gateways of Gnosticism, as far as like corrupting the minds, is you eroticize spirituality. You put eros as above agape, or you interpret the language of agape as if it is eros. So he's doing that. And then I'm like, okay, well, whoever he hates, whoever he's trying to destroy, whoever is fighting him is probably good. That's my hypothesis when I see that. It's not always right, but it's usually right. And then I read the writings of Peter Abelard, and I'm like, holy fuck, this guy's beautiful. This guy's a wonderful human being. And he's like a religious reformer fighting to provide mass education for orphans. He's fighting to take down the different corrupt institutions in the Catholic Church of the time. It's like Peter Abelard he's writing in Platonic dialogues. He's a full-blown Platonist Christian, Augustinian. He's awesome. And of course, he's being destroyed by Clairvaux, who has a lot more political power. So, the drama kind of builds that way. That's kind of how I do it in terms of like the simplest way I could. There's more to it, but that's the most simple way I could say it. Look for anomalies.
I mean, either way, it's impressive. It's impressive because the amount of information you have to go through and like the way you have to piece it together. I imagine it's a bunch of work that just consumes most of your life. I mean, I do just mostly like technical military stuff. If I want to research some weapon system and so on, it can take years. I can imagine it would probably take like half a decade for you to like piece together all of that.
Yeah, no, like it's. I appreciate the words, but I would say when you read Plato, like if you read a lot of Plato's dialogues, I've taken it really seriously. So what he does is he kind of gives people a bit of an edge, because you develop a sensitivity in the course of. Have you guys read Platonic dialogues, like anything by Plato?
No, I haven't.
I recommend it. I was challenged to do this way back in 2004 by some representatives of the LaRouche organization that I'd encountered, and I took them up on the challenge, and I started studying Plato's dialogues. Some of them are really short. You could read them in like an hour and a half. Some of them are a little bit longer. You want to allocate a few days, but they're. I read them all, some of them a few times over, and I got to say, like, what he is doing in those dialogues gives people a serious edge, because he's training the mind, number one, to always look for paradoxes first. Like that's where my method of like paradox, looking for paradoxes comes in, because he's always looking for, like, he starts with what is justice, what is virtue, right? So it's some broad topic like that. Like, how do you define these very, very broad abstract ideas? What is freedom? And then he'll set up a drama, and have a few people talking with Socrates. And the way it works is he doesn't tell you what it is. He introduces, somebody has a hypothesis. They're like, I know what it is. And Socrates is like, oh, what is it? It's like, justice is the will of the stronger to impose, to reward one's friends and punish one's enemies. It's like, oh, is that true? Is that what you think? Okay, well, maybe that's true. Maybe it's true. Let's test it out. And then a dialogue proceeds, where Socrates is asking questions that involve concrete case studies, which will tend to get the person who thought they had knowledge of a thing to find that their argument destroys itself. Socrates is not destroying the argument from the outside. That's the Bernard de Clairvaux method. Clairvaux's method is, it's not part of church doctrine. You are a heretic. You should be burned. That's not it. Socrates' method is to get the argument to be tested with concrete case studies of reality, and where we find a disagreement, we have to then we have to change our hypothesis or live with the dissonance, live with the paradox. So if you're honest, you're willing to throw away your former false hypothesis that you thought was true in favor of striving for a better hypothesis. And so it's all an exercise in doing that. Now, but the outcome is that he's training the mind to not get lost in the branches of the opinions that people have about anything, but you're always trying to sniff out what is the root behind the branches. So if somebody says something about, there's only so much space for people to live in the world, well, I know that they must have an axiom about human nature that they may not have investigated, but it's there, it's present, because they said what they said. They must believe in, they must have a certain set of assumptions about human nature that I will want to question them about. So I'm gonna try to bring the conversation to not the particulars of like the branch of their opinion about what type of energy system we would want to reduce human population. I would want to have the conversation go towards, as much as possible, what is their idea of human nature that they can define that is wrong, because there's something that they must not have thought about the nature of the human mind's capacity to discover God's creation and translate those discoveries into new technologies that allow us to forever break free of the limits to growth. That's something that we do as humans, as our species characters. We solve problems. We have an awe and a reverence for the unknown, for God's creation. And if we're healthy, we've got a certain cultural confidence within ourselves to lean into the unknown, to get out of our comfort zone, because we love truth more than our own comfort blankets of the false axioms that gave us the emotional feeling like we knew something that we actually didn't really truly know. So humans in a healthier state, whenever I look at examples of them in our past, I see that they're all doing that. And I think everybody is equal in the image of God, though we're different in our differentiated personalities and stuff. But yet we all have this common quality of being able to do this and being happier when we do this than when we don't do this. And so I will have a conversation with that person, like I said, about like, well, why do you think there are limits to human growth? Like, what causes these limits? And I'll have the person then give me some answers about like, well, what they believe causes limits. Maybe lack of resources, maybe the fact that we expand like a virus and we just keep on procreating. It's like, okay, well, let's talk about that a bit more, in order for them to hopefully, if they're honest, get to the place where they finally realize that they didn't think about the nature of what the mind does when it's in a healthy, happy state of making discoveries, and then making life better for everybody in a healthier way. So anyway, I'm just saying all of this because when you're reading, like, I don't have to read all of the writings of Nietzsche. I have to read some Nietzsche in order to have an opinion about Nietzsche. But because of Plato's method, I will tend to, you could read some of Nietzsche's essays from the Ecce Homo or some elements from the Thus Spoke Zarathustra, but you could see there's certain ideas he promotes which are the cause of invisible axioms that don't necessarily always come up in his text, but I know that they're there. So you could, I don't have to read everything in order to have a pretty good assessment of where somebody's at as an author. Because again, you're looking for the core axioms, and so it doesn't take me years and years in that sense. Like, I don't have to read all of Madame Blavatsky's works, though I have them. I just have to read a few of some selections in order to get a mapping of the flaws of her axioms in order to then like look for a bigger part of the story that's often being left out when people try, because people they try to data collect. I think as part of academia, I think it encourages us to it's good that academia encourages rigor and peer reviewed has its place, but it can be abused. And I think in our society, it's very much abused, and people will write dissertations, right? Like in PhD studies of political science or whatever the course is in our current society, they'll write PhD studies on like this battle that happened in the Netherlands in 1732 based upon the climate, the fact that there was slightly more drought in a certain like eco region of the Netherlands during this, and they will get grants. They'll be peer reviewed, and they'll write books about it. They'll devote their careers to these hyper myopic things, and it's demoralizing for us to go and see these case studies of people who have just spent their lives in this myopic little realm, right, and with no idea of the context. And that's, I think, a lot of academia encourages us into these little traps.
I guess that's also a good way, like to just divert people from looking at the bigger picture that you present. That you and your wife that you've been presenting for years, and of course, it's also a good way to hide certain agendas that are still out there. And since you mentioned Nietzsche, I actually read his Zarathustra piece, and I mean book analysis. I don't know how to call it. And I mean, I did it because I was interested in the Persian and the Sasanian or Sassanid history, and I mean that was the only reason, pretty much. But I mean, it's interesting, and I understand like why he was not really he was always of sound mind. How he ended up, and like you can see it in his writings. I think it's pretty obvious that I mean all of the all of the counterintuitive things that he said, and I'm not sure even like when I read it and when I compared it to what I read about the Persian history, I wasn't even sure how right he was, and it kind of discouraged me from reading the rest of his works, which might have been a mistake. I don't know. I mean, I'm not sure if how many of his other works you've read. But it was interesting, how it actually pushed me to read more about the Nazis, because the Nazis often cited him as an inspiration, right? When they took power, which I didn't. He did write about the Übermenschen, but I'm not sure if the Nazis really realized or understood what he tried to say.
Well, he is there. I'm not super. He's super clever and very sympathetic. Like when I read a Bertrand Russell or something, I'm like, nah, you're not sympathetic. You're not honest. I think that he's authentic and he's clever and he's very sympathetic. But I think at the same time, he was openly like he wasn't an anti-Semite, and that's why he broke with Wagner. Right? Wagner is way too anti-Semitic and just debauched in general for Nietzsche's taste. But he was a eugenicist, and he was into cultural eugenics. Like he did admonish the doctors for supporting the unfit, saying that these are a weak class that should, so he sincerely did believe that doctors are doing a disservice to the human species by catering to those who are less fit, even though Nietzsche might have thought of those people as being predominantly culturally less fit, maybe more so than genetically, but he did definitely promote those things, and it's very complementary. Like that worldview is complementary to a society that's, I guess, a bit more fascist, if you want to judge. And I agree that there's some nuance that the Nazis lacked when they thought about his Übermensch, but yeah,
pretty much.
Yeah. But I think he could have spent more time, honestly, on drama, because like the thing with Nietzsche that makes me sympathetic is that he admires people like Friedrich Schiller. He admires him, but he despises him at the same time. because Friedrich Schiller was like an optimist, a philosophical optimist, but he was also able to back it up through like utilizing reason quite extensively. And he was a poet and a dramatist. Like he was actually exercising his poetic faculties a lot. Whereas Nietzsche never got into poetry, he never got into drama. He was just like, this is my opinion about all these philosophical matters. But I think he would have helped himself a lot if he took Schiller's path of like trying to exercise that other part of his soul that would be more playful.
He might have, like, maybe he wouldn't have ended up the way he did.
Yeah, like I read his Antichrist. That was fucked up. Like that was towards the end of his life. They say he was starting to, lose his mind a bit more. Yeah. But it's coherent and very, very dark and cynical. Like that's really jarring to read his Antichrist.
I never got around to reading it. So now that you say that, I mean, I guess it would be a waste of time to even try.
It's short. It's short. You can do it in like a day, but it's something. It's something. But why does he do this? Why does he always like contradict himself so much? Like I know a lot of people have said that he's got his reasons for doing that, but why does he often like embrace a contradictory set of like,
Yeah, I asked myself the same question when I was reading Zarathustra, and really or Zoroaster. I'm not really sure what the name is in English because it was in Serbian. I have no idea. Like he was one of the first philosophers I read when I was still in primary school actually at the time, and. It was suggested by an older cousin. I don't know. I don't even know like why I asked. He had a bunch of his books. Like he was pretty much obsessed with the guy. And I just took one of the books, and it was Zarathustra. And the interesting thing is, the only reason I chose that one again it was because I was interested in Persian history, and I thought it actually had to do with Persian history, but not really that much. It was more like a setting, and not really more than that.
Right. Yeah, I wonder, right? Yeah, that's wild that you were so young and you were already like exploring Nietzsche. That's something else, man. I don't know. I just know that that overall what I can detect as being like I was saying before you came on, I was talking about these two events that I'm going to be doing with Cynthia in Toronto this weekend, and one of them is going to be on Dark Age versus Renaissance cultures. So we're going to just examine what are the arts, what is the type of artistic expression, the type of moral philosophy and political philosophy that becomes hegemonic or much more influential in civilizations that go through periods of Renaissance dynamics, and inversely, what are those cultural and ideological norms that are pervasive in moments when those same civilizations will go into dark age modes. Because there's certain every civilization is wonderfully different. We're all commonly human. And so there's these common human attributes for good or for evil that express themselves in certain ways, like sophistry will express it. We have examples where the sophists take control in Greece, in Rome, in our current day, in India, those who are trained to make the false appear true and the true appear false, right? Ugliness appear to beautiful, and vice versa. And we have opposing schools that actually see that that have this idea, like in China, it's, you got the Confucian mandate of heaven, that the laws of humankind are only legitimate if they abide by the mandate of heaven. And you got that in Augustine's school as well, that there's the city of God, that the laws that man creates are only to be recognized as legit if it harmonizes with the intentions of the creator and the creator's laws. And if we do that, then those laws should be abided by. And if those laws are in opposition to God's intention, then they should be seen as a form of violence, if anything, and should be overthrown. But you got these same schools in two different parts of the world coming to the same, Confucius said, do not unto others as you would not have others do unto you. And Jesus said the inverse, like do unto others. But it's the same idea of the golden rule that everyone's kind of picking up on and realizing this is not just a nice flowery thing to say to make us feel good. This is like the basis upon which civilization survives or doesn't, and acts accordingly. So I always look for I try to categorize as much as I can the philosophers who are born in time in terms of seeing like what side do they align with, as far as even if they're not self-aware, their axioms will tend to participate more in one or more in the other. And then I look at what they're doing and what are they like, what's Adam Smith doing? What's he a part of in the physical world, right? I know his ideas, but what's he physically doing with Lord Shelburne? Why is Lord Shelburne hiring this guy to come up with a wealth of nations at that moment in 1776, right? So what about Malthus? I know his theories. If you're a philosopher or an ecologist, you study Malthus's theories. But it's like, what about Malthus the man at the same time? Do his theories match what he's physically doing when he's teaching at the University of Manchester? Training the next generation of British East India Company managers. Oh, it's very much the same thing. So you always want to look at like physically, what is that person doing? And then what are they saying? And to what degree are their ideas influential for good or for bad, as far as having the outcome of reducing human freedom and human activity on the earth, or enhancing man's power and dominion over nature, a la Genesis, like, is it gonna, which one is it helping out, the oligarchy or humanity? So in that sense, Friedrich Nietzsche so far seems like a bit of a tragic character in my assessment when I look at the application of his ideas, but not a bad guy, not an evil guy, I guess, in my view.
Yeah, I mean, that's the impression I got. Like, tragic, not necessarily bad, but also like picked up by the wrong people and just misrepresented. Like really, really tragic. Like during his lifetime, and then afterwards in death. Like it's a really tragic fate for what I think is not really a bad human being. It's just just a misfortune, I guess.
Yeah.
Well, thank you. I mean, this is so fascinating.
Hey, dude. No, it's a pleasure, man. This is fun. Yeah.